Hi everyone. This video focuses on linking resources in Rails. In the last video, we built a Rails app with a single resource, a product resource. And so this video is going to extend that by creating a shopping cart and then setting up a many-to-many relationship between the cart and the products, right? Any given shopping cart can have many products in it, and any given product can be in many shopping carts at once. And the way we'll do that is by using a third resource called line item. This line item resource corresponds to what we would call a joining table in the database. If you haven't worked with databases a lot before and you're not familiar with the concept of a joining table or a many-to-many relationship, I encourage you to pause this video and watch the video I linked in the comments, which explains these ideas in more detail. Now, before we get into that, I want to add a few small details to what we left off with in the last video. So first is seeding your development database. So if I go into the depot directory here and I go down to database, there's a file called seeds, and that's the file that's open here. And what this does is it lets you programmatically seed your database, to programmatically create a set of records that you can use so that when you first run your app, you have some data in the app and you don't have to enter it all by hand. Now, I did copy this right from the book we're working through. And so what they did is they first began by deleting any products that are already in the database. What that means is if I reseed the database, I start from scratch every time as opposed to adding additional duplicate copies of any books. And then the way we're going to add an item, in this case a product, is that we'll call the create exclamation point method. Now, what the exclamation point does here is it raises an exception if for some reason the record can't be created. The most likely reason for raising an exception would be that the item we're creating here fails the validation. For example, if I tried to use create exclamation point on an item that was missing a title or had a negative price or something like that, then the seeding of the database would fail. So we have a title, a description. This % curly brace notation here is just another way to delineate a long string in Ruby. This would be kind of like the triple quotes in Python. Notice that this description has some HTML in it, like an emphasis on the title and so on. That'll become important in a minute. Okay, so we have our 3 books to seed our product database. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run bin Rails db seed. So you remember last week we ran db migrate to set up the database. Now we're going to populate it with db seed. And bin Rails server, let's launch the app. One small problem, Code Anywhere didn't pop up that box to the right saying, do you want me to open a web page to your app for you? All right, so if that happens, here's one thing you can do. You can go over to your Workspaces tab, expand the data for your specific workspace, and then you see this workspace ID. So we'll copy that. The workspace ID will be the primary part of that URL. And now I can go over and open a new tab to HTTPS. And the first part of the URL is going to be the port your app is running on, which for Rails is 3000. And then, well, my cache filled that in. But what you'll see here is the next piece is that ID you just copied, .app.codeanywhere.com. So if I visit that page, there's my default home page for the app, which we haven't changed yet. So what we really want to see is the products page. All right, and then there's the plain listing to the products. If you've been reading through the book, there is a place where they replace that index page with something styled a little better. I still have the plain version here. But one thing you should notice is that the description has the HTML in it, right? Instead of seeing the title in italics, we're seeing the tags themselves. All right, so let's see why that is. If you open the product partial, you can see where we've inserted that string right into the view. And when you do that, Rails will by default escape any HTML. Let's see if we can see that over here. Let's take a look at the source to make it a little more clear what's going on. So I'm going to come over specifically to sources and then scroll down And what you can see is that Rails replaced the angle brackets with the HTML characters that represent the angle brackets, right? So what that causes is the display to literally be less than sign, P greater than sign, less than sign, EM greater than sign, and so on, as opposed to rendering HTML directly into the view. And that is done to prevent code injection. For example, to prevent somebody from typing HTML or even like a script tag into an input field and having that have an effect on how the page is rendered. Now, in this case, we actually want that HTML to be rendered as HTML. So the way you can do that in Rails is by calling a method called sanitize. And when we do that, then Rails knows that it is safe to insert the literal HTML into the document. Another thing you'll see is the name of the image URL. So it's just the plain old name of the image. Well, let's make that a little bit nicer. And instead of just printing out the string, let's use a helper called image tag. And what that will return is not just the string, but an HTML image tag using that string as a source. And if we do that, then the actual image shows up. Okay, that's a little bigger than we want it to be. Okay, so let me see if I can fix that quickly by specifying a width. Okay, that's better. All right, so not quite as nice as the highly stylized version in the book, but this does demonstrate a couple of tricks that you might find helpful. I should also mention that in order for those images to appear, they do need to be in the app. So that would go under App, Assets, Images. I did copy those images from the book's website and put them in that images directory. Okay, so now let's get to the business of adding a cart and being able to put products in a cart. I'll bring down the server for a minute. So we need two pieces. The first piece we need is a cart. So we'll use scaffold again to create a cart resource. Now, at the moment, we don't actually need any explicit columns in the cart. So I'm not going to list any. I'm just going to say generate the cart. And let's see what that does. That gives us a migration, the create carts migration. And the only thing that this is putting in there are those timestamps. And although it's not listed here, every table has a unique ID. So we are also getting a unique ID. You'll notice that your cart follows you from page to page. Once you started putting things in your cart, they stay there. And that's done through the session that we talked about in class last week. So as it turns out, looking forward, we are going to want multiple pages to have access to your cart. So there's going to be code that's finding the cart given the session that multiple different controllers are going to want to use. So the Rails way of being able to share code among controllers is in the directory called concerns. So I'm going to move over on the command line here to app controllers concerns, and then I'm going to create a new concern called current cart. So we'll come over to current cart. This is going to be a module, and I'm going to follow the book's pattern here and make this method private. And so the cart object we're dealing with is going to be the cart for the current user. And we're going to get that from the session. So remember, session is this globally accessible object that is attached to a particular user's session. So the first time you visit this website, it's going to send a session cookie, which is effectively a long random number that your browser is going to send back every time you visit the site. And so in the background, Rails is going to take that session cookie, use that as a lookup in some sort of database, maybe a literal database, maybe an in-memory database, and return a hash called session. So we're going to use in this hash a key called cart ID. So when a controller calls setCart, what it's really saying is set the instance variable to the cart object that corresponds to the current user as defined by the session that's been established in the background. Now, if this is the first time the user is visiting the site, this find is going to fail and it's going to raise an exception. In particular, it's going to raise the record not found exception. So if that happens, here's what we do. If this happens, it should mean that this is the first visit by this particular user. That's why we can't find the cart, is we haven't opened a session. So we'll call that create method on cart, which, if you remember from the discussion about seeds at the beginning of the video, creates a new cart object and saves it into the database. So we're at the point now of either we have that cart because we already have one and we found it, or we have that cart because we just created a new one. And then if we've created a new one, we want to save its ID in the session so that it's there for next time. I should have said this earlier, but current cart is a module. So in Ruby, a module can be code that is mixed into another class. So what's going to happen here is that the concerns for the controllers are going to be added as modules, which effectively makes setCart an instance method on any controller that includes it. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to associate carts with products. Okay, and if you remember from the beginning of the video, the way we're going to associate carts and products is through a table in the middle called line item. And this is a standard way using relational databases to have a many-to-many relationship, where any given cart can have many different products in it, and any given product can be in many carts. And if you see here from the middle, the primary properties of this line item will be the cart ID and the product ID that we're linking together. Right, so we need another scaffold. And you can use G as a shortcut for generate. All right, so now what are the properties of this particular resource? We're going to have a product, and that's going to be the name of that column as product. And the type will be references. So Rails is going to apply a convention here. So because we chose our column name to be the name of another resource, Rails will figure out the connection, and the reference is the type. We'll see what that does in a minute. And then we're also going to have a column called cart. Again, it's the name of a resource, so Rails will make that connection automatically. And the type here is belongs to. Oops, I need to go back to the root of the project. All right, and then the next step will be to run the migration. Actually, before I run the migration, notice we now have two migrations that haven't been run yet. And the second one is this here. And so we can see that references the product table. This alt references the cart table. And to be honest, I don't know why one is references and one is belongs to. I did a quick bit of research and it sounds more stylistic than anything else. So if you find a different, more accurate answer, please share it with me. All right, so let's run that migration. And when we run that, if we look at our models, you'll see we now have a line item model that has that belongs to relationship set up for both product and cart, which again reinforces that the references may be primarily a stylistic choice, because in terms of linking the models together, Rails just ended up using belongs to. Now, what the belongs to does is it means if we have a line item object, we can access the product it references by simply saying .product. For example, if you pardon me just typing abstractly here, if I have a specific line item that I retrieved in some way, I can do things like li.product.title. That belongs to is what adds this product property to the line item object and connects it to the actual record for that product. Now, we also want this to work in the other direction. So if we come over to the cart, if we have a cart object, we want an easy way to access all of the line items that apply to that cart. And we do that with hasMany. And we'll add one other parameter here. And what that dependent destroy means is that when this cart gets destroyed, we're saying that any dependent line items should also be destroyed. So since the line items are connecting the cart and the product, if the cart goes away, we have no use for those line items and we can just automatically delete them. And just as before, if we have a cart from whatever search we do, we can now talk about cart.lineItems and have the list of line items associated with the cart. Similarly, if we come over to product, the product also has many line items. Now this time we have a little bit of a different relationship, and that is if we delete a product, if we remove a product from our store, we don't want that product to be in any carts. That would create a rather awkward situation. So of course we want to handle that. So first, let's write a method. All right, so here's the idea. Before we can delete a product, we have to make sure it's not in any carts. So either we need to finish all those sales or we need to invalidate the carts or something. So the logic here is that unless there aren't any line items associated with this product, meaning this product isn't in any carts, then we need to raise an error of some kind. So we'll raise an exception if that happens. And by adding to that errors array, if we're deleting a product through like a CRUD operation on the products web page, then we'll be able to see that error. So when it fails to delete, we have that data there and we can display an error message explaining why it failed to delete. So what we want to have happen is that before we go ahead and delete any given product, we want to run this method down here to check to see that it's okay to do that deletion. And so Rails has a hook for that called before destroy. So now let's wire this shopping cart up into the application. And the way we want to do this is by adding an add to cart button on the index page. So if we go back to the index page, so I'll come into that product partial. There's the price, and let's add a button. So Rails has a helper called button 2. So the string is what will appear in the button. There's add to cart. Now we need a URL or a route to submit this to. And so when we add something to the cart, what we're effectively doing is creating a line item object. So let's see here. If we do bin Rails routes, get this out of the way, scroll up to the top here, and here's our line items. So if we're going to create a new line item, then we're doing a post to line items. Here, let me see if this works quickly. Yep, we can see that a little better. We're doing a post to line items. That is what is tied to the create method on the controller. And its prefix is line items. So we will use the line items path. Again, line items coming from that prefix I have highlighted down below. And then we need to pass some more information. So when we create this line item, we need to know what product it is. So we'll pass the product ID for the current product. And I do apologize, the syntax highlighting is a little messed up here. Now you may be wondering, how do we know if we're saying line items path if we're doing the get or the post? And it turns out that the Rails convention is that a link does a get and a button does a post. So since we're calling the button to method, we're going to be doing a post. And then we can also do some styling. This button is going to be implicitly inside of a form. And so we're going to make that form inline so that it can be right next to the price. Okay, so now let's go over to the line items controller. and wire everything up. All right. So anything we do with line items needs to be done with respect to the cart for the current user. And we get that with the setCart method we put in the concerns over here. All right, this module. So if we go back to the controller, we need to begin this create method by calling setCart. Now, remember I said that current cart is a module. And what a module in Ruby is, it's code that can be imported into a class as if it were written in that class definition. So to make that work, I have to ask for it. So I have to say include current cart. And so imagine where you see include current cart, what you're more or less doing is copying and pasting this setCart code into the line items controller. All right, so what came through that HTTP request is just the line item of the product we want to add to our cart. So the first thing we need to do is to actually get that product object from the database. So we'll call product.find. And the ID is in the HTTP parameters. So params, and we call that product ID. So we'll grab that ID, which is just a number, out of the body of the HTTP request and use it to fetch the product from the database. And again, remember, the reason we need to do this is because this is a new web request. So we don't just have all of the other variables from the previous controller just lying around. And so now we need to create a line item object that links the product and the cart. So the way we'll do this, we'll call it line item. We'll take that cart object, which we got from setCart, remember? Calling setCart, set an instance variable. And so that instance variable is available. And then we'll refer to the set of line items in that cart and call a build method. So just a shortcut built into Rails where we're going to build a line item connecting that cart, that object is already there, initiating this method call, and the product. Okay, so this was the code generated by the generator. We're not going to use that, so we'll just take that out. But the rest of the code is still relevant. So the first thing we'll try to do is save that line item object, push that object into the database. So if that save is successful, then we want to see that in our cart. So instead of redirecting to a line item, we want to redirect to our shopping cart page for this specific cart. And then if we can't save it, we need to handle that error in some way, but we will come back and deal with that later. Now this piece right here, I take from the book to be consistent with the book. And to be honest, I don't know why we're getting that cart through the line item instead of just saying at cart. Let's see if this works. All right, now I did this live, so there will certainly be a few glitches here and there. I'll try to go through some of this debugging quickly, and maybe it'll help you recognize some errors you run into. Oh, so I see it. There needs to be a comma between these two parameters. And there's our add to cart button. So let's add this second book, wish me luck. Line item was successfully created. The rest of these three, the edit and back to carts and so on, is just the template code from the generator. As we work through the rest of this, these will get replaced with something more appropriate for this app. Okay, so this isn't very helpful though, right? If we're going to look at our cart, we should at least be able to see what's in it. So here, let me clear out some of these tabs. And now, so if we want to see what's in the cart, that would be the index of the cart. So we'll go to Views, Carts, index.html. Now what it does by default is render each cart, but remember, the cart really doesn't have any of its own properties at the moment. If we look at the partial, there's nothing there. So what would it mean to show a cart? What it would mean is to iterate through the items in the cart. So let's do that. First, put a little bit of a header in here. And now we'll create a list. And inside that list, we'll iterate over each item in the cart, each of the line items. And what do we care about for the line item is the product associated with that line item. All right, so now let's try that. We can see what's in the cart. Okay, let's play with this just a little bit more. Now what if I add this book? Ooh, that's interesting. That's the only item in the cart. And notice it is cart number 2. If I go to cart number 1, that's the first book we added. All right, let's see what happens if we go back to products. And I'll add the Docker book. Now we're on cart number 3. So we've got another bug. All right, let's see if I can find that quickly. So how could we track this down? So let's go to the code in the concern that gives us our cart. Something must not be finding the cart when we need it. So how about if we do this? Let's go to the products controller, include that module, and make the session available to the index so that when we look at our products index, we can see what that looks like. When I print this out, I can see everything associated with the session, but when I look for the data, I see card ID with a D, not cart with a T. So somewhere, there it is. When I create the new session, I saved it with the wrong name, so the two aren't connected. All right, so we'll load this again. So now if I add this book, that'll be number 4. But with any luck, if I go back to products, I have cart ID number 4. So if I add a book, there it is. Now I see both books. Go back to products. Let's add the Tailwind book. Now I can see all 3 of them. And just to show you, you can, if I add a second copy of this book, we can see that that book appears twice. Okay, so now we have all the basic pieces there for having 2 tables where we can have 2 tables that are linked together. In this case, they're linked together in a many-to-many relationship, so there's actually 3 tables, but it still illustrates the key idea of having that has many and belongs to, which then lets us refer to those linked items in a very natural way through properties on the different model objects. I also highlighted some other Rails conventions and shortcuts along the way, and so hopefully this is one step closer to being able to use Rails to put together an actual application. So as always, follow along here. This lines up with chapter 9 in the textbook, and so if between the 2 of those you're not getting a thorough understanding of what's going on, stop by and I'm happy to fill in the details.